All right, this is OPEX sport-specific training for energy system training on the assault rower. So basically what we're trying to ask here is, can there be energy system training on the assault rower and things that we've discussed, whether it's through gain, pain, and sustain, or mixed modal pain, or mixed modal sustain, that will contribute to becoming better at your sport? So that question is always abound, and there's a lot of opinion and argument and really healthy debate on the concept of athleticism and sport-specific training and how it carries over to some of this loosely defined concepts of conditioning for health, okay? And that's unfortunately, but it's okay, that's where we land on this. So the way to figure out exactly if it's going to be effective for sport, if any of this energy system training on the assault rower is going to be effective for sport, we have to talk about, well, what's the differences in intentions here? So let's start with the intentions of the athlete versus the intention of the human. The intention of the athlete is to go towards pain and points and pleasure and prizes and more pain and more points and more pleasure and more prizes. And it seems kind of unvirtuous, but the athletic pursuit is very challenging. It's very admirable. Sometimes it's sacrificial in human capabilities, but that's the whole concept, is to go after these really high striving efforts of maximum potential, okay? So now that I've set it up that way, that's exactly what you should be thinking when we use the word athlete, and everything that goes inside the training program should benefit that. So then you can say, well, is there something inside of energy system training for the rower that may help that? Maybe. I'll discuss that in more detail if we classify some different areas, maybe. For the human, it goes back to what we discussed earlier. It's the concepts of what's inside that's going to be most utilized for a long-term definition of health. So what's the intentions for athletes? It's these short-term, high-intense phases of living, because the goal is to try to perform as best as possible in the sport. For the human, the embedded goal should be to live as long as possible and as large as possible. Those are just loosely defined ideals of what a long, life would be, but it has to be a healthy life, a vital life. And so everything you do then in training has to lead to that defined aspect of life, right? So what could get in the way of that is metabolic failure in training. What could get in the way of that is injury from training. What could get in the way of that is anything that's mechanically or metabolically too challenging for people for different intentions. So you can see I kind of, put the athleticism intention on top of that for human endeavors, and it's just not going to make sense long term. So the intentions of athletes, completely different than the intentions for humans. This is maximal expression for a short period of time. This is to live long and prosper. So that allows you then to step back and say, okay, every session that I do, what's the deepest intentions inside of that? And so I hope you know that when we talk about sport-specific training, we are focusing on athletic pursuits. So anything in here has nothing to do with trying to live long and prosper. It has to do with you benefiting the sport as much as possible, and that's the overall goal. Sport defined is very hard to do, because you can imagine looking at the differences between lawn bowling and darts versus cross-country skiing versus doing something on the water. I was thinking of skiing, so water slalom, to downhill biking, to rock climbing pursuits. Like, sport becomes so loosely defined, but you just have to recognize that when we are going to do a real super generalized concepts of sport with the same idea in mind in here, just so we could pick apart, well, is that going to be beneficial to do energy system training on the air rower for that sport? Well, at least we could kind of simply classify everything that's going to be that maximal pursuit of that physical expression. But you're going to have to, get your own ideas inside of what that sport means. But as long as we know it's a generalized concept here that we're using, we'll be okay. What general versus specific means is something for you to consider relative to what the sport uses and holds to being very specific, being very individualized for the sport, and how you're going to apply the ear rower training and energy system training in general to that. General practices versus specific practices. We'll take fighting as an example, right? Specific training for fighting would actually be the skills that involved in fighting. I'm being very reductionist on this, right? What's general training for fighting? That could be resistance training, some specific kinds of gymnastics activity, learning some different lifestyle practices, learning recovery practices, etc. That's generalized training that could be beneficial to the specific training of the sport. Now, why do I pull these out and classify them in two different ways? Just so you can recognize that for the specific training for the sport, you can see that the air rower has no part to play in what fighting looks like in the octagon or in the ring, right? So just look at the actual sport and how it's defined at its ultimate expression, and then ask yourself the question, is the air rower in there? No, it's not. So the reason why you need to know this, although it may sound stupid, is that there actually is some sports where the air rower may be involved in the specificity of the sport. That's only one sport thus far. Well, I'm going to classify mixed modal as possibly also meaning different kind of mixed modal events, because there's lots of different mixed modal events that are out there to now expressed. So that's the only one where you're going to get specific air rowing in the sport, as well as general training of the air rower in the sport. I'll use multiple other examples so you can at least understand what I mean by this and why we need to classify them out. Because then you need to know at least how important is it for the air rower to be inside of this training. Baseball. Is an air rower showing up on a baseball field? No, it's not. Therefore, it could be a general concept of training that might be beneficial based upon the sport. But it gets classified over here as general practice for conditioning, energy system training, etc. That could be used for the specific sport. And you can see I can go down a laundry list of specific sports in which you would say, oh yeah, the air rower has no part to play in that. And the only reason why you do that over and over is to come back to these basic conclusions we've drawn for many, many years, that you can't be overzealous with the practice of that particular thing just because it exists and saying, oh, it's a fitness thing, therefore fitness is involved in the sport, therefore we should be training it a lot. That's the wrong conclusions to make based upon just the fitness practice. Just recognize that it takes place in general preparation and general practices, but it's not going to have any carryover whatsoever for specific training and specific preparation. Okay? So that allows you at least to pull those things apart. So lastly, I do a super generalized component of different, 5 different areas of what we consider sport practice. And I've done this for the assault bike too. You can go back and review that for energy system training on the assault bike for sport specificity. And it's the same thing applies for the air rower, but I'll just go through those briefly. So for tactical activities, and that can mean multiple different things, what you're going to be using the air rower for, and it could be of practice of help, is actually just conditioning for what's required on tactical practice for the getting into those tactical areas, which would be called recruitment scenarios or initial testing, as well as maintaining a specific kind of physical fitness level while inside of those tactical areas. Now, you will not need to be elite on the air rower to either get into entry or to maintain good physical practice within. So we're going to say that the air rower techniques in gain, pain, and sustain may be used as a base general practice approach to not only help you build characteristics of fitness to get into those tactical areas, but also to maintain good levels of fitness while within. Now, to be honest, are there other methods that you can use outside the rower for those two things? You certainly can. But it doesn't mean that the air rower can't be used as some form of fitness characteristic building for those tactical measures. Mixed modal, we've actually already indirectly discussed that, but there's multiple different forms of air rowing practice that are needed actually, not only for general approaches for mixed modal as a sport, but also specific approaches. You remember the fighting example I'd given you, right? So yeah, you can do deadlifts as a fighter and get better at just, doing deadlifts and maybe some strength gain, but it doesn't resemble anything like what you're doing in the ring to be doing punching, okay? So now think of mixed modal. When you're in the ring punching in mixed modal, you are actually using an air rower. Now in the general practice, you're also using an air rower. So you can see that it's of utmost importance that you get really good at gain, pain, sustain, mixed modal pain and mixed modal sustain on the air rower, because it's going to complement you doing the sport here as best as possible. You're not only getting the general fitness characteristics improvement of that, but you're also getting carryover to the sport specific example in general. With regards to force, I'll be very blunt and simple with it. If you want to get really good at force, and force is a major component of your sport, just do everything that improves force development and repeated force development. What can impede this is being overzealous with energy system training. I'll be really, simple on that one. I just seen it happen way too often where people get really excited around getting in shape, or in an off season trying to get conditioned really good for the force development sport, and they actually get into areas of decreasing force development and decreasing proprioception, which is really important for force development. So more lifestyle practices and proper implementation of a progressive force training program would be far more beneficial to optimally observe practices of force. So where does energy system training for the air rower come into force? Not really a lot. One thing I would offer as a caveat to that is that a little bit of sustain training, if it's done really effectively, that's only OPEX sustain training, not OPEX mixed modal sustain, OPEX sustain training, can be effective of helping recovery between really forceful sessions, okay? But I'm not going to say it's like the winning answer for increasing recovery for force development. I'll just say that all the other practices, OPEX gain, OPEX pain, mixed modal sustain, will probably inhibit force development. So if you're in a sport where that's really important, just basically take this very easily, and it may help you in terms of recovery, and that's about it. With regards to endurance, you can get what's called some systemic improvements of aerobic capacity in the non-specific endeavor that you're doing the endurance. So I'll make that sound, very simple. This actually can be applied to endurance, okay? You're a runner and you want to get really good at running, and you've been running for a long period of time. This may act as a secondary component of your endurance activity that keeps you from running more. Because over a period of time, more and more volume of the specific endurance sport may not get you the answers you need. So you may need to be doing technical things, changes in pacing, new coaching, changes in your lifestyle, changes in terrain, et cetera, but you may also want to add some form of training over here in general preparation activity that is endurance in nature, hear me, sustained, and the practices within there that could add to your, let's call it your roundedness of endurance capability that could carry over to your endurance as a sport. Secondarily, just think of it in terms of mechanics, just only use an example, it gets you off your feet. So if you're over here doing endurance activity, you're not running, which is kind of a nice thing. So you're doing what's called systemic endurance improvements, while at the same time you're staying away from your actual sport-specific involvement. So I'm going to allow you to figure out where the mechanical, differences apply there. If it doesn't make sense to you, if you're rowing on the water, the erg is going to be used specifically and has been used for a long period of time to improve that, of staying off the water but just getting some reps in for the specific demand. But all other sports that are called endurance sports outside of that, I would say that OPEX sustain and OPEX mixed modal sustain can offer a nice side note benefit that keeps you away from your specific sport overload movements, but allows you to get some systemic improvements in aerobic activity. Where you can air in there a tiny bit, which I'll just allow you to figure it out and make some adjustments to it, OPEX gain and OPEX pain, you may get some benefits. I'm not going to say you won't, but you may get some benefits of doing that effectively. Only with the rower, not mixed modal pain, but this would only be OPEX gain or OPEX pain on the air rower, and go back and review those videos. All I would say is that experiment with them and see if it makes some improvements on the litmus test of what you're determining is the litmus test for that endurance activity. And then I would say that it may be beneficial that you're going to do that. Now, dynamic activities is very broad and it encompasses a whole bunch of different sports, but I hope you're understanding that we're talking about very, really high dynamic contractions and dynamic activities. Now, inside of that, speed is involved, reaction is involved, proprioception is involved, power, taking force contact, etc. All those things are involved in that sport, and that's what's going to be practiced most times within the sport. So all the practice that you do away from this particular sport environment cannot inhibit all those things. So what does inhibit all those things? Pain activity inhibits all those things. Overtraining inhibits all those things. People being tired inhibits those things. People doing way too much strength training inhibits those things. So you can see that, I hope you heard in those language, OPEX gain, OPEX pain, and OPEX sustain, if all done incorrectly, can inhibit the practice of and your specialty of performing dynamic contractions as aerobically as possible. Or sorry, yeah, well, I guess aerobic is possible, but as best as possible for as long as possible. So dynamic contractions are somewhat similar to force development sports, where there could be the odd case where you do some easy OPEX sustain progression on the air rower that can help in your repetitive dynamic practices. So let's just say this. You're going to practice the dynamic sport 5 times a week for about 90 minutes to 2 hours each time, okay? So you could be saying, I've now seen all these videos, you know, how could aerobic capacity help me in my sport? Just go back and say, how could all those things not help? And then say, what's going to be beneficial to help me recover as fast as possible between your sessions? That's the first thing you should be looking for. That's the first improvement you should try to be making. Not putting more work inside the sessions, not doing more harder stuff in each sessions, is saying, how do I recover faster between the sessions? And so OPEX sustain on the air rower could possibly, like force development, help you improve recovery between those dynamic contractions, okay? Now that's a very, very generalized approach to sport specificity and where the air rower comes into that for energy system training, but hopefully it gives you some ideas to know where you can push it a tiny bit and help, and when also we got to err on the side of not doing too much to impede the sport development. Because in the end, if you want to be good at your sport, you got to play the sport often. That's the #1 answer. In review for sport specificity for energy system training on the assault rower, understand the difference in intentions for athlete versus human. Understand when we try to define sport, it's super generalized and we're just being okay for that for this conversation. Understand the different in general practices of fitness training versus what's specifically necessary to be good at the sport, and I gave you the fighting example to remind you of that. And then you can ask, in buckets of sports, where does this fit? Is it tactical, mixed modal, force development, endurance, or dynamic based? And then you can kind of get an idea where energy system training on the air rower is going to fit in for that.